to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we have a special guest with Danny Sheply here. He has been, covering Ole Miss and has been a fan for the past couple seasons. And, given his track record with following Ole Miss, I felt it was, time to kind of have a guest on and everything with that. And we've been, following the SEC and all that good stuff. So right now Ole Miss is in, a pretty good spot here down in Oxford. They were 11-2 last year, first time in program history they were ever at 11 wins, winning the Peach Bowl last year. They returned a lot of strong starters such as Jaxson Dart, third year player who transferred from USC. You have you also have some returning guys on the wide receiving core and the tight end core. According to FanDuel, they're projected to go 9-3, with the possibility of also making possibly a playoff run, and they are also ranked with the 20th recruiting class of 2024. So Danny, with that said, you're going into this year. It's pretty big expectations. It's going to be Lane Kiffin's fifth season down in Oxford. So what are your general expectations, and what have kind of been the vibes like down there in general?
Yeah, it's a pretty exciting time. Normally, with the new playoff, it's going to 12 teams, so expectations are definitely a lot different than what I would anticipate. Because with four teams, you have a lot less leniency to lose, and every game matters a lot more. But with the new playoff, it should be a lot easier for Ole Miss to sneak in there, hopefully, and make a run at it.
And we talked a little bit about this off camera too, but obviously there's been a lot of new guys in the coming in from the transfer portal. I talked briefly about the recruiting class. They're 20th now. So with that said, do you have any top players in terms of new players coming in that you're excited about seeing?
Yeah, as far as the transfer portal, they did make a lot of noise in that. Of course, with that, you're losing a lot of players, which puts a lot of expectations on them performing now, which puts a lot of pressure on the coaches. But a few guys to keep an eye on is a couple of offensive linemen, Daquan Wright from Tennessee and Diego Pounds from North Carolina. I expect them to start right away and make a pretty big impact. And for wide receiver, Juice Wells from South Carolina. And the top JUCO player was formerly at LSU, Deion Smith, was recently allowed to practice, so now he's with the team, and he should have a high role in there as well. And for defense, Chris Paul Jr., linebacker Arkansas, Princely Umanleleyan from Florida, defensive end, and obviously the number one player in the portal, Walter Nolan, who will have a lot of expectations, but should be a pretty key factor for the defense this year.
Yeah, and it's great you brought up Walter Nolan too, considering that they're definitely going under a transformation in terms on the defensive side of the ball. You do have new defensive coordinator Pete Golding coming in, who's definitely should make a positive impact, because even when you looked at the team last year, to me that was one of the two of the biggest glaring weaknesses that I saw in terms of Ole Miss's sort of playoff potential. Number one, I think the defense does definitely have to step up a little bit, but when you bring in a guy with the caliber like Golding, who has coached in the SEC for such a long time, and you bring in these top guys, and on top of that, I think the other thing that I think Lane Kiffin really wanted to address this year was the offensive line. I think the one thing that, although there are a lot of skilled players on the offensive side of the ball, at the same time, if Jaxson Dart can just get a little bit of better protection, and especially with Jenkins going to Ohio State, I'm projecting to see a lot more of that kind of spread offense, and also just in terms of maybe rushing the ball a little bit less, or kind of a running back by committee. So with that said, I kind of talked about the weaknesses a little bit that I see. Do you have anything you want to elaborate on in terms of kind of the weaknesses that you see of Ole Miss, and what would you be nervous about going into this year for them?
Yeah, there's a couple of things. The defense, formally, I mean, they are consistent, but at the same time, when you're putting up a lot of points with a quick offense, they're going to be on the field a lot. and there's a lot of pressure on Pete Golding to put all these transfers who are new here into the system to get them all on the same page right away. It's going to be a lot of pressure, but and then as far as during the season, I feel like in big games they can come out hot, and then second half something throw an interception, something bad happens. I feel like it all falls apart. I think they need a better job of keeping their composure in big games and not letting one play determine the rest of it.
Yeah, and even too, I know in general, in terms of the transfer portal and all that stuff, you've seen a lot of different coaches kind of have different perspectives on that. Of course, if you want to talk about, for example, completely, anti-portal, we can think of the Dabo Sweeneys, the Greg Schianos, Troy Calhoun over at Air Force. But, in general, I know Lane's kind of been, pretty proactive in terms of, getting the transfer portal. And, with that said, too, another thing that's kind of going along with this is, Ole Miss's schedule this year. You know, they do have some tough matchups in general, but the one thing that I did see is, they probably have every single reason to be able to at least start off 6-0. Now, you start off with Furman, Middle Tennessee, then you go to Wake Forest, you go to Georgia Southern, and then really where it gets a little bit more interesting is, they're gonna host Kentucky, they're gonna be away at South Carolina, then they're gonna be away at LSU, and then home, versus Oklahoma, and then I'll dive into the games after that. But obviously with the SEC being expanded, what are your thoughts on Texas and Oklahoma coming in? And out of all those games that I just listed, are there any games that you're primarily concerned about? Because I know at least we'll be doing an episode on South Carolina later, but to me, South Carolina is one of those teams where, regardless of where they're at in terms of whether it's kind of the pinnacle of South Carolina when they were under Steve Spurrier, or now when you're under Shane Beamer, they're always a tough matchup. So out of all those games, or even just particularly South Carolina, or any of those games that you're particularly concerned about?
Yeah, I would say Oklahoma, even though it is at home, it is following or before an LSU game, and the timing of that, I feel like it could be a game where they don't feel as much pressure, especially being at home, and that could end up hurting them.
Yeah, and also too, I mean, LSU has always been consistent with having strong recruiting classes. I mean, even when you go back to Brian Kelly back at Notre Dame, he's always been one of those guys that high enthusiasm, high energy, just the guy you want to run you want to play for. And obviously too, with the SEC being expanded, there's just simply not as much room for error compared to the past couple seasons where you can get away with a couple more kind of, I guess you can call them filler games compared to the Vanderbilts of the world and all that too. And as we go down the cycle here, they after they go to Oklahoma, that then they have Arkansas, then you got Georgia at home, you go to Florida, and then you have the traditional Egg Bowl. So with that said, I think a lot of people would pretty much speculate that outside of you have, to me it seems like you have Georgia as the favorite, followed by Texas, and then you probably have Ole Miss as sort of the as could be that third or fourth team in the SEC if more than two get in to the 12-team playoff. So with that said, obviously I do think the big time matchup would be versus Georgia. So with that said, this will be the last question here. How do you think Ole Miss fares against Georgia, and what exactly do you think that Ole Miss needs to do in order to set themselves up to be in a situation where they will be contending and be in a playoff and a position to make a run?
Yeah, it's an interesting question for Georgia. We have to be consistent and be able to control the clock and not ruin our own game. We got to play within ourselves and not get out let things get out of control. Georgia will always be consistent. They're going to run the ball, play stout defense. Just comes down to being able to bear the punches and throw them back, and hopefully keep it within a one possession game until the end. And as far as competing with Georgia as for further into the future, It's going to be interesting to see how the transfer portal keeps going out. I would like to see a little more balance between the recruiting classes and the transfer portal. Just as far as development for players, I feel like it would help a lot to have them there as freshmen and develop them as opposed to them coming in for a year or two. But yeah,
Yeah, and actually one more thing that this kind of that is kind of thought about too. I briefly mentioned Jaxson Dart. He did struggle a little bit at the beginning, but Ole Miss has honestly been one of those programs where they constantly have a really stacked quarterback room, and I think last year really went to show how much of a leadership role that he took. He managed to significantly limit the amount of turnovers that he had. He was really smart with the football, and he was able to get it to his playmaker. So with that said, obviously he decided to forego the NFL draft and go to his senior year. So with that said, what what do you see in Jaxson Dart right now, and what are some things that we should be looking out for in terms of the offense?
yeah, I really see with Jaxson Dart. I feel like it's really come full circle since he's got here. With the last season, he had a lot of pressure. The quarterback room was stacked. There was a quarterback competition. He handled it maturely. He didn't complain. He didn't say anything. He went out there and he played and he won the starting job. And with that, he had his best season ever. So this season, I'm really hoping it all comes together with the offense and they can click quicker into the season as opposed to later in the year, so it can be a more fluid season for him. But Heisman is pretty lofty expectations, so I wouldn't say that, but I definitely would like to see him in the running for it.
Yeah, and that's good. That's good that you brought all of that up too. And at least for me, Ole Miss is definitely one of those programs that I'm really excited to watch this year, especially how much the expectations have just significantly increased. Obviously, before they had Matt Luke first season there, and he kind of fluttered, and now Lane Kiffin's really kind of finding his stride and really kind of bouncing back after kind of those lackluster tenures at USC and Tennessee. So I think it's gonna be really exciting to watch, Ole Miss's progression this year, and I appreciate being generous with your time and coming on.
Yeah, thank you. This is a great time.